How do the brains of autistic people differ from those of neurotypical people? That's the question I'd like to explore in this video. To do that, I want to introduce the research of Dr. Olga Bogdashina, one of the leading voices in autism studies. In my previous video, we already spoke about sensory overload and one of the theories she discusses. This time, we'll look into the intense world theory by Henry and Camilla Markram and what it suggests about how the autistic brain works. Did you know that researchers have discovered that certain brain processes in autistic brains differ from those of neurotypical ones? Let's focus on the cerebral cortex, the outer layer that covers the brain with all its tiny folds. You can imagine it like the peel of an orange. See that peel here? That is the cortex. And inside, there are tiny vertical columns of nerve cells called mini columns, consistently communicating with one another. Now, one might expect that because autistic people are often said to have difficulties with communication or social interaction, there would be less activity there. But what scientists actually found was the opposite. These regions are hyperactive. Let's picture it. Imagine the cortex is the vast city made up of countless high-rise buildings like this one. Each building represents a small group of neurons that process information, consistently communicating with one another. The sensory quarters of this city, the districts responsible for sight, hearing, touch, and smell, these buildings stand tightly packed together. They work day and night, receiving sound, light, texture, scanned, millions of impressions every second. In a neurotypical brain, the walls between those houses are thick. Sounds that arise inside a building stay inside. Even the floors here are isolated from one another. Each district can therefore operate calmly and in order. The principle is called lateral inhibition, the brain's own form of soundproofing. But in autistic brains, Bogdashina describes something different. In many sensory areas, the walls are thinner, and the houses themselves stand closer together. So, when a stimulus arrives, a sound, a flash of light, a touch, the whole city wakes up. A signal jumps from house to house. Lights appear everywhere. This phenomenon is known as sensory overreactivity. The brain doesn't respond too slowly. On the contrary, it reacts too quickly, too strongly, and too synchronously. The energy flows through the city before anyone can control it, like an electrical grid where every consumer switches on at once. And there's another detail. The sensory district, so those high-rise neighborhoods that process incoming stimuli, they stand right next to the city's power station. Here, that's our power station. They are the first ones to draw current whenever energy is needed, because they sit directly at the entry point of the sensory output. That's in the brain. We see it here, yeah? That's the sensory output. They receive the charge first. And since these towers are so active, almost all the power is consumed in that area by the towers. But of course, these sensory quarters aren't the only parts of the brain city. There are other districts where higher functions take place, such as emotional decisions, language, movement, and balance. In autistic brains, researchers also found out that their buildings stand a little farther apart, more separated than in neurotypical brains. That means less exchange, less alignment between neighboring houses. And when down in the sensory city, all the lights are already blazing at full power, there's little energy left for the upper districts. That's when the city begins to flicker. Traffic lights fail, telephones crackle, messages arrive incomplete. And if you were talking to someone while the line kept breaking up, lights fail, telephones crackle, messages arrive incomplete. And if you were talking to someone while the line kept breaking up, neurobiologically speaking, when the sensory areas are overactive, the associative areas, those responsible for integrating and interpreting those signals, are inhibited. So even if those, and when down in the sensory city, all the lights are blazing at full power, there's little energy left for the upper districts. That's when the city begins to flicker. Traffic lights fail, telephones crackle, messages arrive incomplete, as if you were talking to someone while the line kept breaking up. Neurobiologically speaking, when the sensory areas are overactive, the associative areas, those responsible for integrating and interpreting those signals, are inhibited. So, even though these impulses reach the brain, they fluted so intensively that prioritizing information becomes just impossible. Scientists call that multisensory disintegration. A state in which the senses no longer cooperate properly but interfere with one another. And this explains much of what we observe in everyday life, especially in autistic children who have not learned to mask their perception. A child might, for instance, look away because faces, lights, and movements all rush towards them at once, and it simply becomes just too much. Or a child hears a sound but doesn't respond because it merges with all the other sounds around. The walls between those houses are just too thin, that everything blends into one great cloud of noise and doesn't stay in the column where it belongs. Or a child may not speak, not because they can't or won't, but just because the building for speech processing has hardly any energy left. Everything has already been used up by the sensory towers. And here lies something essential. This way of processing information in autistic brains is not a defect. It's simply a different way of handling sensory input. These stimuli aren't perceived too weakly. No, they are perceived just too strongly, too unfiltered, and therefore they may arrive at once and often, therefore, just too chaotically. And this is where many researchers call the intense world theory begins. Boghdashina often refers to the work of Henry and Camilla Markram, who developed the model of the intense world theory. And let's return to our image of the city. The intense world theory suggests that the walls of those high rises, that scared me. Yes, that the walls of those high rises are not only too thin, but there are also far too many connections between them. That means a single sensory stimulus, a flash of light, a touch, a sound, sets off an entire chain reaction. The impulse races through every quarter, lighting up the windows and streets, the whole district, and remains visible long after the original stimulus has faded. Boghdashina explains that this hyperfunctionality affects not only sensory input itself, but also the emotional and memory areas are linked to it. A sound is not merely loud, it also gains emotional weight and is stored in the memory for longer. A touch isn't simply felt, it lingers as a physical and emotional state throughout the body. This shows why reactions in autistic people can sometimes appear too strong. A sound, for example, may stay alive in the mind long after it has stopped, because it's processed not only through the hearing, but also through emotion and sensation. In our city, this looks like this. A single power failure in one district can affect the entire grid. A small spark in the west makes the fusses in the east blow. That means the city isn't too weak, it's too sensitive. So, what do we learn from all this? Boghdashina writes that genuine support for autistic people doesn't start by trying to change their behavior. It begins by taking their way of processing the world seriously. By taking the way of their processing the world seriously. So, I often read a comment in my German channel, but the child has to adapt. It has to learn to cope in our society. Yes, and of course, to a certain degree, everyone has to adapt, whether it's neurodivergent or neurotypical. But the real question is, to what extent, isn't it? We need to recognize that for autistic people, this isn't about defiance. It's not unwillingness. It's not about refusing to fit in. It has biological reasons. The brain simply works differently. And no amount of external pressure will change that. You can't force the city to rebuild itself by shouting at it. Instead, we should create environments that offer calm places where the constant flood of sensory processing can slow down a bit. Where the city's circularity can just settle so that not all the energy is consumed in the sensory districts. and the more can flow upward towards language, emotion, and social connection. And that, hopefully, is what we can take from this video.